Hello again, YouTube, Global Hawes, prior enlisted Marine, history buff, and overall just somebody who does a lot of research. I have decided to expand my repertoire a bit with videos that include the past, the topic I love so much, history, and I'm going to be including a little bit of future technologies that have my attention. So with this particular video, I decided, well, since this happens to be the 80th anniversary of the Doolittle Raid, I've even got a shirt appropriate to it. Uh, First to strike Japan with one of the B-25s on it. And I figured, why not start the history lesson with the Doolittle Raid? Well, early into our entry in World War II, we were in sorry shape in the Pacific. Almost all of our battleships had been knocked out. The first battleship to arrive after Pearl Harbor was Battleship North Carolina, and her guns had never been fired in anger. She was a very, very new battleship, one of our fast battleships. And we'd already, by this point in the war, we'd already conducted the Marshall Island raid just to show the Japanese that they had not knocked the fight out of us like they thought they did. And the Philippines had already fallen by this point, so the Japanese had taken that. They'd also taken Singapore. They moved rather rapidly across the Pacific, and they were looking to expand their empire a little further, although they had switched their focus from the sea to the land. They were looking to expand their sphere of influence in China. And they were not meeting with much success. Meanwhile, we had 3 aircraft carriers in the entire Pacific Fleet. And that was stretching it because one of them had just joined the fight. Yorktown. Oh wait, we did have 3. We had the Saratoga, we had Enterprise, and we had Hornet. And we were looking to, if nothing else, do another symbolic raid to show the Japanese that we were going to get you at home. So, Jimmy Doolittle was tasked with what was at the time an insane proposition to take medium range army bombers, which weren't even built to do this, fly them off of an aircraft carrier, strike Japanese targets, and land in still Chinese held space on airstrips in China. During the course of which, Hornet was loaded up with 16 B-25s, escorted by Enterprise's flight air group. And so the 2 carriers and their respective escort ships began making their way towards Tokyo. And they were supposed to launch, I believe it was something like 400 miles away from Japan, but they had to launch early because they were spotted by patrol ships. Well, the patrol ships were promptly sunk, but radio transmissions were detected coming from them. So they had 2 options, either abort the mission or launch early. Jimmy Doolittle elected to launch early, which still worked out in their advantage because of the fact that Japanese weren't expecting medium bombers to come from these 2 aircraft carriers. They were expecting our carriers to get a lot closer. So as a result, the Japanese timetables for how long they had to respond were way off. And in the course of which these 16 bombers ended up flying over Tokyo along with Kobe and Yokohama and dropping various incendiary and high explosive bombs over top of those targets, striking primarily industrial targets on the way through. They were strategic targets, things that would have later on helped the war effort. In fact, it is covered in the memoir of Jimmy Doolittle, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. And Doolittle, he was a daredevil. He was known for doing tasks with planes that was thought impossible. So he was the perfect man for the job, and he had rounded up a squadron of Army Air Corps bombers. So unlike Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor, that was bull. They had designated B 25 pilots that they specially modified these planes. That part was accurate, where they were taking all sorts of things off of these planes that they normally would have. So armor plating went bye bye. And so did in just about anything they could carry that they didn't need to carry. And even then, they were launching well past their their launch points. So a lot of them, all of them ended up ditching anyway. And some of them ended up bailing out over the Sea of Japan. A lot of them ended up ditching in Japanese held territory. Quite a few of them were captured and killed, which was unfortunately a Japanese thing at the time. They believed that your honor was the most important thing of all, other than honoring the emperor, who was believed to be a living god. So if you had any honor at all, you would die protecting it, rather than allow yourself to be dishonored by being captured. So they did not treat their POWs well at the time. And so all 16 of the bombers were lost, which they were supposed to be transferred to the command of the Chinese Republic's Air Force. And it didn't end up happening. In fact, Jimmy Doolittle ended up, on his time trying to get back to friendly lines, he ended up finding one of his bombers stood atop of it and thought he'd failed. When, in fact, the symbolic victory of it was actually felt quite heavily here in the States, as well as in Japan. It was like it was a symbol to us that we were going to get them, even though we weren't there yet. We were going to get them, even if it just took a little while. We just had to come up with a better way to strike them, and later on we would. And for the Japanese, well, aside from the Mongolians centuries before, no one had been able to touch Japanese home territory in a while. And yes, the Chinese and Japanese traditionally fought over Okinawa for a while. But Japan itself, the home islands, were generally considered safe, even divinely protected. So to have their enemies strike them at home like that, in their capital of all things, it actually made it so that way the Japanese were honestly pretty worried. The emperor himself was not injured in the attack. They intentionally left that alone. But they shifted their focus from the land back to the sea to focus on us. We had effectively gotten their attention. And so they decided to continue to expand on the defensive ring around their empire to focus on the islands that was basically warning beacons to the empire itself, and possibly even points that had to be taken out in order to actually get to the home islands. And that was actually covered later on in the war in the island hopping campaign. And so towards that end, they had effectively diverted the Japanese. And to see the idea of launching bombers off of carrier decks, that was only ever done once. To my knowledge, it's